Our first step was to process the data by preprocessing it with KNIME, which included removing the invalid data and passed the time information. After that, we imported the results into a MySQL database. Then we created our first overviews of the data, for example, simply plotting the amount of entries per minute for the IDS log and firewall logs in Tableau. Our next step was to apply some filters to the overviews, for example the most entries for one specific IP or the most used ports. These overviews led us to some specific IPs and ports, which we investigated further and resulting in the timeline of events. The timeline represents significant moments covered in the IDS and firewall logs. The first significant moment happens at 8:25 p.m. on 5th of April. Here is the first appearance of IRC traffic in the IDS logs and also the first appearance of connections from several workstations at nearly the same time to the destination IPs 10.32.5.50 to 59 over port 6667, which is normally used for IRC and peer-to-peer connections. This is probably the first policy violation because neither file sharing nor social networking and communication is allowed. It's likely that the machine using IRC are infected with a bot which is using IRC to communicate with the bot owner. The next event, which happens at 04 am on 6th of April, can be described as a possible attack on the firewall from the inside. The IP 172.23.231.69 is trying to connect 18 times to the firewall IP 172.23.0.1 over SSH. This IP has also a lot of connection at the same time on port 6667. A minute later, the same IP is trying to send SNMP requests to the firewall, which we identified as another way of trying to connect to the firewall. Overall, at the same time, the amount of connections built on destination port 6667 is spiking, as seen in the lower part. On the upper part, the IRC authorization messages is not spiking, which could mean that these connections on port 6667 are not entirely used for IRC. The third event is the overall drop-down of connections from 2:24 p.m. to 8:05 p.m. on 6th of April. This is only noticeable in the firewall logs and not in the IDS logs. The fourth and fifth event, which happened at 8:05 p.m. until the end of the data, are connected to this drop-down. The overall connections are normalizing, but there are also increased suspicious activities. Although the IRC authorization messages are now lower, the activity on port 6667 increases, so it's likely that the port is now used more for non-IRC related connections. A completely new IP address appears, which is building a lot of connections to port 6667 and 80 again to the destination IP range 10.32.5.50 to 59. It's likely that this IP is an external laptop because it's alone in one subnet, which is 172.23.252. From the amount of connections, it's possible that this specific IP is doing a DDoS attack from the beginning of its existence until the end of the data. Right after the normalization of connections, there is an unusual high amount of FTP connections to the outside. The amount of infected machines is possibly connected to the activity on port 6667, so the distinct count of source IPs using 6667 as destination port can be an indicator for the amount of infected machines. The origins of the arrows show the time frame of the matrix representation, which shows every connection built with the source IP on the x-axis and destination IP on the y-axis. We can clearly see the range of source IPs connecting over port 6667 is spreading to a wider IP range.